More than 20 years ago, I began a journey, my quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is the Black Vault Radio. I am your host, John Greenewald Jr. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and making this your podcast and radio show of choice. I know there's tons of options out there. So thank you for tuning in and joining me. I'm going to be honest with you. This is going to be very different, and I hope it is the only show that is this different from any other that I will have to air. If you have missed the news this week, if you're not following either my social networking or really this is anywhere and everywhere when it comes to the field of UFOs, this week is a pretty sad one for anybody that has an interest in this field. Mr. Stanton Friedman passed away on the 13th, which was Monday of this week that I am dropping this show. Now, I can tell you firsthand that this community, the UFO community, the truth-seeking community, the research community, the investigation community, they are going to sorely miss the contributions of Mr. Stanton Friedman. Now, in episode number 1 of this very program, I interviewed Stanton Friedman. I chose to do that for multiple reasons, but first and foremost was the fact and reality that he helped a 15-year-old kid, now more than 22 years ago, get interested in the field. Now, I already have told this story quite a few times, not only on this program briefly with Stanton, but in lectures and so on. So I don't mean to beat a dead horse if you've heard it, but I'm going to tell you again anyway. Now, when I was 15 and interested in the UFO phenomenon, at the time Alta Vista was the search engine, not Google or anything like that, you just would get an insane amount of information. So what I did before really filing a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests was reached out to the people that were prominent in the field. Stanton was only one of them. It doesn't matter who else I wrote because I'm not here to bash anybody. But I wrote them letters, physical letters, not emails. I mailed them. This was 1996, not to date myself. But it was obviously a little bit different back then, especially with email. I always felt that, there's a personal touch to having some kind of letter that arrives in your mailbox. So I wrote everybody. I can tell you that there was well more than about 15 letters that I had mailed out to people that I could find, P.O. boxes and so on. I of course, used email as well. But I always felt that there was just a little bit more personal touch when you actually mailed a letter. Well, Stanton was one of them that I had mailed out, and I mailed them all out, and I waited. Now, I had started my Freedom of Information Act trek at this point. It was all around the same time. So I sent out all those letters, started filing FOIA requests. Well, in addition to the letters I was getting back from the government, up pops a message from Stanton Friedman in my mailbox, an envelope, a big one, a thick one. So I thought, wow, this guy actually wrote me back. And I remember opening the envelope with a nice letter from Stanton Friedman. Now, that's going to be for me to keep to myself. He said some very nice things, very encouraging things. That I'm going to have that be personal to me. But what he sent me was a stack of documents of his own writing that he would sell if, and rightfully so. I'm not saying that disrespectfully, that he would sell at conferences, that he would lecture at, $3, $4 for stacks of stapled pages of his writing. And then obviously he had a ton of published books as well. But these were papers that he had published through the years, and he would sell them. And without charge, he sends me this big stack of papers. Now, I still have that. In fact, I have every page that everyone has ever sent me, including the government, in my archive. So this week, I wanted to do this a couple days ago, a little bit more timely, but I'll be honest, I needed a few days because it's kind of a detrimental blow to me personally, because those documents that he sent, they represent why I stayed in the field. I don't know what would have happened if he didn't write back. I mean, I'm not going to lie and say I'm only here because he sent me that envelope. I'm not going to say that, but I will say that he showed me what it was like to research and to investigate and to be in this field. And I remember reading those documents. I dug out the folder that I created when I was 15 years old, when I got this response from Stanton Friedman. Still have it. Dug it out this morning before I sat down to record it. I took some pictures. I'm going to post that on the show notes page. If you don't know how to get there, it's theblackvault.com/show notes. And you'll see what he sent me. It was all of his writing about MJ-12 and Project Blue Book and UFOs and science. And the pictures that I'm posting is just a sampling of what he was sending me. And I was just floored at the amount of research that he really did. And what I will say from an influence standpoint, he taught me how to be thorough with those documents. Now, he and I didn't chat immediately after that. I did mail him a thank you letter. We didn't chat for about a year or two. There was no other reason other than I was Stanton Friedman, I just didn't want to take up his time, and, what would he want to correspond with a teenager about? So I kept those documents. I've kept them all the way through more than 2 decades, still in my archive, as a representation of who he was and as a role model for people and kids like me. And he influenced me in the sense that I realized I may not always agree with everybody's approach or everybody's final conclusion, and Stanton as well. And he knew that. But his approach, Stanton's approach, was more thorough than I think that I have ever really seen. He would pick up the phone, right? Like nobody does that anymore. They Google search. He would pick up the phone. He would hop in a plane or hop in a car. He would go to archives. He would sit down and thumb through documents, and he would actually look for answers that no one else got. He would open up phone books and track down people that no one contacted before. He spearheaded a movement to bring not only Roswell back into the forefront of discussion, and he made amazing discoveries, but he applied his research skills, his investigation skills, to other areas in this niche, in the paranormal /UFOs whatever you want to call it. And he did an amazing job. And so these documents really taught me from a young age, cover your bases. And that's what Stanton did. And it came through in his writing, even to a 15-year-old kid who knew absolutely nothing. It was evident to me he knew what he was doing. And it was also evident to me that he was one of the very few that would go to the greatest lengths you could go to either prove or disprove something. Now, like or love or hate his final conclusions, it was irrelevant, because the way he would research and the way that he would put it all together, for me, was so telling about who he was, that he wanted to cover all of those bases. Now, fast forward a few years after he sent me these documents. Now, we had chatted on and off through this, but I remember then back in, I believe it was about 2003, there was a symposium by the MUFON, and their international symposium was going to be held in Dearborn, Michigan. Now, MUFON had reached out to me and asked me to speak at this particular conference, and I was really kind of honored to be asked that. But I looked at the roster of other speakers, and Mr. Stanton Friedman was going to be on it. Now, again, we had shared communications throughout the years, but this was going to be, I think, really the first time that he and I would be on stage at the same symposium together. I had lectured prior to this, but it was for local MUFON chapters and so on. So this was going to be the biggest stage that I had ever been on, and at the same weekend, Stanton was going to be on it as well. So, of course, I accepted and hopped on a plane and went out there. Now, I didn't know if Stanton would even remember. I mean, he probably talks to so many people, and, it's not like we were buddies hanging out on every Friday night. So I had no idea if he would even remember me at this point, or our correspondence through the years or so on. And I remember seeing him and walking over and just wanting to finally shake his hand and look at him face to face. And to my amazement, not only did he say, "Hi, John," without me introducing myself, shook my hand, he talked about the respect that he had for how the Black Vault was going, that he was actually watching. And I told him, I said, "I don't know if you remember this, though. I was a 15-year-old kid," because at this point in 2003, that's about, 7-8 year difference or so. I said, "I wrote you and you sent me a stack," and he remembered. He remembered that 1996 interaction. And my letter must have struck some kind of chord within him, because what he had told me on why he sent it, which I'm going to save for myself, was amazing to me, that he remembered and that he believed in me, believed in a kid, believed in a 15-year-old who had accomplished nothing. I mean, I got in trouble in school a lot. That was on my resume, but that's about it. He believed in me and saw something and sent me his material to give me that motivation. From that conference on, he and I remained friends. And we would correspond quite a bit, see each other at multiple conferences through the year. We would see each other, have dinner, spend a lot of time together, and just all around got to know each other. And I see all these comments online, and they're so amazing to read, because so many people understood who Stanton was. And he touched a lot of people in various ways, from motivating, from influencing, from confirming with what he would write. He did so much for so many. And I'm here to tell you, for me to be this lucky to have gotten to know him and be friends with him, and not just with UFOs, but to be able to sit down and, have dinner with him one-on-one and just talk about not UFO stuff. I mean, that if you think he's fascinating about UFOs and Roswell and all of that, I hope that some of you listening may have had the opportunity to sit down and just talk to him about non-UFO stuff, because he was an encyclopedia of history and knowledge and science. And I mean, he knew his stuff. And it was so fun to pick his brain and just laugh. I mean, we would be able to laugh and share jokes. And I mean, it really was a fun time for me every time that I would run into him, because he was real. Especially this day and age, we start to see that some people, they, just maybe believe a little bit too much. that some of their cases that they back or some of the claims that they make, we're all, some of us, and me included, we sometimes forget we need evidence to back up some of the things that we want to say. We need to seek answers for the questions that are still unanswered. And that's what he really aimed to do, is answer those unanswered questions. He sought the evidence when there was none. And that is something that has always influenced me and will for many more years to come because of what he sent to a 15-year-old kid. I'll tell you guys another quick story. This was a very fun experience for me. I had lectured at one of Stephen Bassett's X conferences, in which Stanton was also a speaker. This was one of the other times that he and I saw each other. Well, this was held in Washington, D.C. Now, for those who don't know, the National Archives, kind of the nation's library in America, is only a hop, skip, and a jump from Washington, D.C. It's not too far, in a place called College Park, Maryland. Now, there was some, I guess, if memory serves me well, because this part I don't really remember, there were some Roswell boxes around this time, or potentially Blue Book, I'm not sure. But I do remember that Stanton and I were chatting, and he said, "Hey, I'm going over to the National Archives to do some research. Do you want to go?" Now, if Stan invites you to a government archive, it does not matter what you are doing. You drop whatever you are doing, and you say, "Yes, no problem. When are we leaving?" And I remember we went to the National Archives, and I had never been before. And so to kind of be taught the lay of the land by someone like Stanton Friedman was pretty amazing for me. I won't lie. Of course, there are people to help you, but if you have an archivist or you have Stanton Friedman, well, the answer is simple, that you want Stanton Friedman to kind of guide you through the process. And that's what he did. And he showed me, how to pull documents and how the process works and so on and so forth. And so he had pulled the boxes that he wanted to pull, and you kind of wait. If you've ever been to an archive, you just kind of hang out and wait for about an hour. They'll pull the boxes, and then you go pick them up, go to a table, go through them, see everything, and so on. So we had a little bit of time together to chat and wait for our boxes. Now, he pulled the again, either Roswell or Blue Book material. I want to say it had to do with Roswell and some of the research the Air Force did, that some of it was enclosed boxes. And it turned out, I don't think that there was anything earth-shattering in that. It was just some boxes that had been finally opened and cleared for release. And so Stanton had pulled those. I went a totally different route. I started researching non-UFO related things. I remember pulling not only the psychological profile that the CIA did on Adolf Hitler, which was fascinating, but also some World War II documents that I remember opening up the envelope, and I'm sitting feet from Stanton Friedman, who's going through these documents. That in itself is like, you just sit back in your chair and take it all in. Because again, this was a legend when it came to seeking documents in archives. And here I was sitting feet away from the man who just taught me how to do it. And he's going through his documents and I'm going through mine. I remember opening up one of the envelopes and out spilled a bunch of World War II era documents. But on top of that, because these were in the CIA record or old OSS files, in that particular record group is what they call them, there were actual Nazi documents and work papers and books, all complete with the Nazi eagle and swastika stamps on it. And the history behind it was these were some of the spies that were actually in Europe working under these falsified papers. And so when they, and in addition to all those falsified papers, because when these people had come back, the men and women had come back, they would have to turn in everything. Also in there was the amount of money they got paid. It was really fascinating And I can go off on a whole tangent on that. But I remember, I think Stanton kind of caught his eye that I had these, swastikas in front of me, which was a little bit disconcerting when people would walk by your table. But it was history. It was amazing history. And that was something that Stanton always appreciated. And I remember just chatting with him throughout that day, pulling documents. And of course we would just stay silent and do our own research and take our own notes and do what we were doing. But sitting at the same table was an amazing experience. So I wanted to share that with you guys about who he really was as a person, as an investigator, as a researcher. And especially this day and age, I am seeing so many that have failed to rise to that level, that they don't understand the importance of evidence. And that was one thing that Stanton always taught me, and I sometimes get myself in trouble asking questions. Even recently in the last year, there are some that are out there that don't like me very much because I am not afraid to ask those questions. But if there was one thing that Stanton taught me more than anything else, it's those unanswered questions that are the most important to any research project that you might undertake. You have to be able to answer those unanswered questions. And until you do, you keep asking. You keep digging. You keep going to the archives. You keep opening the phone books. You keep doing whatever it is that you can do to answer those questions. And that was one thing that Stanton always talked to me about and taught me through his work, through his writing, through his lectures, and through our one-on-one conversations. They were just things that I had picked up on from him that have resonated. And I hope that, I hope it shows, I hope that others will see the importance of people like Stanton, because he's not alone, but he's a rarity when it comes to researchers that care about the evidence. He definitely was not afraid to tackle those unanswered questions. And those unanswered questions really would teeter into like a land that not many people would want to go. But he was not afraid. He would meet all of those unanswered questions and four-wheel drive into those territories that nobody wanted to go in order to get those answers. We can all, myself included, learn something from those tactics. And even though I've known Stanton, knew Stanton for more than 20 years and had amazing conversations, I still learn every day that we need to be reminded sometimes to just kind of sit back, open the phone book, make some phone calls, and do some research before we start making the crazy claims. And I think that that's something that he has taught all of us, or at least the ones that were willing to listen. So my thoughts and prayers and really just my thanks go out to his family. And the reason I say thanks is because it's a sacrifice to really have someone like Stanton who was always working. He never stopped. When he passed away on Monday, this is all I know about it, that he was in an airport in Toronto. And he was found in the airport as he was, I believe, on his way home, traveling, doing what he loved, lecturing. And he did an appearance in Ohio, and it was on the trip back that he passed away inside the airport. Cause is unknown. I remember one thing that I told him just about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, on the telephone. We had talked, I pulled my phone log just to kind of see. I mean, we had about a half hour, 40-minute conversation. And one thing I told him was, I know you always say you're retired, Stan, but come on, you're like the busiest retired guy I've ever met. And he laughed and he says, well, John, I'm 84 and I'm coming up to my last, lectures and this and that. And he says, it's time to stay home, And he's been retired for what, I think it's like a year or it's quite a while, but he really was busy. He couldn't stop because he loved it. And that was another thing that has influenced me over the years, that as you seek the answers and the method that you seek those answers, you got to be thorough, you got to be diligent. But more than all else, you got to love what you do. And he loved it. He loved talking to people. He was always there. He was always there to shake your hand. He was always there to field a question. He was always approachable. I don't think I ever saw Stanton mad. Now, I'm sure over the years, he was mad quite a few times. I wish I saw, by the way, that conference that he and I saw each other at. Phil Klass was in the second row for every lecture. I gave him credit for that. But I'm sure Phil Klass over the years made Stanton mad, and vice versa. But you know what? He didn't really show it that much, at least not while I was around. He was an amazing person. So this show's a little bit different. Generally, since it's not live, we don't really do repeats. But I think it's important that I go back and show you guys who Stanton was. And this will replay episode number 1. Even if you heard that episode, I recommend, listening to it again, because he was an amazing person. And that's what I tried to kind of nail in the interview, that he's not just the Roswell guy. He's much more than that. I also cleaned up the audio a bit. I've learned in 30 plus episodes now of the Black Vault Radio that there's certain things that I can do to help with the audio and make it clean and make it sound good. That's what I did with Stanton's interview. So this, sadly, I've been meaning to do it for quite some time. And with this episode, I feel that it's worthwhile to revisit that interview, but also with some cleaned up audio. So keep in mind, this did air about mid of 2018. So there might be some timestamps stuff in there that may or may not make sense. But in the end, I hope you get to know a little bit more about Stanton Friedman, somebody that we all have loved and respected and really kind of looked up to for quite a long time. For me personally, more than 2 decades. So Godspeed, Stanton Friedman. I know those unanswered questions, the ones that he couldn't answer, I trust are actually answered right now. If there are such a things as ghosts, I hope he comes and visits me one day and maybe gives me a hint on what some of those answers are. But like I said, Godspeed, Stanton Friedman. Coming up, I want you to listen to episode number 1 and the interview with Stanton Friedman. That's coming up. This week on the TBV Dialogue segment, I'm very excited to welcome the man, the myth, the legend, but most of all, my friend, Mr. Stanton T. Friedman. Now, Stanton gave his first lecture back in 1967 on the UFO topic. He's a nuclear physicist by trade, but we will always remember him as the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. But his story, after me knowing him for so many years, his story goes much, much deeper than that. Stanton, welcome to the Black Vault Radio.
Delighted to be here, John.
I am very excited to have you on this show. Now, I kind of want to tell a quick story before we get going. And the reason is because I love telling the story of how we met. And if you can believe it, it is over 21 years ago that you and
Hard to believe.
Yeah, I know. It is very, very hard to believe. But over 21 years ago, I was 15 years old, and I was fascinated by this topic. And I looked into everybody that was involved in everything and every angle and so on. And I tried to write letters to everybody out there, all the big names of ufology. And as a 15-year-old kid, I wasn't sure who would write back, if anybody. I will not name names of who all I wrote, but I will name you. You are the only one that wrote me back as a 15-year-old kid. And here we are, more than 21 years later. You sent me, I don't know if you remember this, you sent me a package of material for me to read on your own dime and your own time. And you sent that to me via snail mail. I still have all of it. And that motivated me to do what I have done. And here I am more than 21 years later, still at it. and honored to have you on this show. And it's a true testament to who you are, because we all know you're an amazing researcher, right? I mean, that's a given. Your history in this field is extensive. But I wanted to point that out for those who don't know you personally, because it really is a testament to who you are as a person, in addition to a researcher. So I wanted to tell you on this inaugural show of the Black Vault Radio that you truly were the original inspiration for me to do what I do. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. I wish there were more that I could say that I am inspired, but I've been impressed with your approach to things, John. It seems to me you put facts first. How amazing.
Yeah. Shockingly, there's not a whole lot of people that do that nowadays. And that is what struck me about you in the very beginning, is that you truly, I think, pioneered the original research angle. I mean, a lot of what we hear today, and not to take away from anybody, but a lot of what we hear today is stuff that's just kind of been rehashed or hashed over, or people taking one thing from one person and another thing from another, and then just kind of putting it together, and then they make a blog out of it and they feel like that's theirs. But you really pioneered that original research angle, and that's always what has impressed me about you. And
just because I've been into 20 archives, John?
Yeah, and the amazing numbers too. I mean, 20 archives. I don't know how many documents you've gone to. You want to take a guess at how many documents you've probably gone through?
Thousands. I don't know. I read an awful lot of stuff, and it comes out of when I was working in industry. I found that I had to get the facts in hand.
Mm-hmm.
I was in radiation shielding on advanced nuclear systems. And there were times when we had disputes about the best way to do this or that. And you got to have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear, or you're going to look like an idiot.
Mm-hmm. I wish more people would take that advice. Yeah.
Well, I think it's necessary. And there's enough conflict in the world without putting fake news out there or thinking something is true because somebody who heard it from somebody else. That's not good enough.
Yeah.
And you get surprises. But there's nothing like being... if somebody would pay me, I would have spent full time at archives.
Yeah, would be nice.
Well, the Eisenhower Library, the Truman Library, and the Library of Congress Manuscript Division and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of great stuff out there. But it takes work. I mean, you got to ask for it, and you got to go there and read it. And it's effort, but it's fascinating. And, there are a lot of mysteries in the world at this time. Ufology is only one of them. But I think it's very important that we recognize that our place in the universe is not at the top of the heap.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I think that is the fear for a lot of people, to make that realization. I think people like us, and maybe a lot of people listening to this, can handle it fine. But I think that there are a lot of people out there that want to be the top. And if they find out that they're not, that in itself is the national security risk. And to be honest with you, I think that is the motivation for this cover-up. Now, before we get into all that, I want to back you up into your beginning days. You touched on it very briefly already, but I want to ask you a little bit more. Before you got into the Roswell incident and really started with your ufology, can you kind of give the audience a little bit of a background of, who Stanton Friedman was prior to that?
It's easy. When I was a kid, I read lots of science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
When I went on to become a scientist, I didn't read much science fiction. I was too busy working my way through college and university and stuff. Believe it or not, I was a union waiter at a good restaurant in Chicago for 3 years while I was at the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Learned a lot about food that I didn't know, I'll tell you that. I couldn't have afforded to go there myself.
You learn a lot about people, too, doing that. I was a food server and bartender myself, and I miss it, but you learn a lot about humans by doing that.
Yes, you certainly do learn a lot about people. And so I worked my way through school, and, I was naive. I got a job with General Electric, and my dad had worked for the same company, American Cyanamid, for 37 years. And I was looking at the charts. Gee, I can retire. Gee, he's got several nuclear divisions. I was particularly interested in nuclear because Enrico Fermi was at the University of Chicago, and I was very impressed with him. died while I was there, not because of me, but
Yeah. I don't mean to laugh at that, but I got you.
The idea is that I started with GE with the idea I'd stay with them until I could retire at age 57. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
After 3 years, and the program, many Americans don't have any concept of how much money was spent on these advanced programs, but at General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department in Cincinnati, basically, Evendale, Ohio, if you want to be technical. In 1958, we spent $100 million. We employed 3,400 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. We're not talking about 6 professors sitting around a table with 10 grad students.
Mm-hmm.
It was a major program, and I was very lucky. Yeah, I was one of the younger guys because I hadn't been in the military, and there were a lot of guys who had been, GI Bill and all that sort of thing. And so I was fascinated by the work, but I could see the handwriting on the wall that I didn't see. I told people when I left that I didn't think there'd be a GEAMP project in a year or two because there was no leadership being provided.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the company had nothing invested except the rug on the boss's floor, literally. There's an old government facility and so forth. So it was fascinating work, exciting. I did experiments down in Texas and at Oak Ridge and in Idaho, and radiation shielding, that was my bag, how to protect people from radiation. And, I went on 4 separate jobs that all got canceled. Aerojet General Nucleonics, compact reactors for space vehicle applications. And I worked at General Motors Allison Division, again, compact reactors that you could transport from place to place. And the crowning glory was Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I worked on nuclear rocket engines. Mm-hmm. And I'd say the high point in my industrial career was when we successfully operated the NRX-A6 nuclear rocket engine propulsion system out not far from Area 51 at the nuclear test site.
Wow.
And, here we got a reactor, total diameter was under 8 feet. Power level was 1,100 megawatts. And Hoover Dam produces 2,000 megawatts. It's a hell of a lot bigger than 8 feet in diameter.
Mm-hmm.
And they played, we had a live, we could listen to the actual test of that at our classified facility. And it was exciting because we didn't have any idea how long that thing would operate. Nobody had done this before. I mean, the exhaust temperature of the liquid hydrogen going in, it was cold when it went in. It was 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit when it came out.
Wow.
We had no idea how well this thing would stay together.
Mm-hmm.
Would be shaken to pieces, would dump the fuel elements through the nozzles, who knows? So that was the high point there. But I got started on UFOs really, in a sense, because I'm a cheapskate. I was ordering books from Marlboro Books a long time ago, mail order place. I needed one more book so I wouldn't have to pay shipping.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, head of Project Blue Book in the early 50s. And it was marked down from $2.99 to $1. So because my shipping would be covered for the rest of the order, it was costing me nothing. So what the heck? Our program was co-sponsored by the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission, the nuclear rocket program. So, it was exciting and it was cheap. And the book intrigued me. It didn't convince me, but it intrigued me. And I was surprised. What made me angry a little bit later, that was in 1958 when I read that book. It was at the University of California, Berkeley Library in the early 60s. And I found a copy of Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. Now, that did surprise me because it hadn't been mentioned by that time. I'd read 10 books, some of which were garbage. And none of them had mentioned Blue Book Special Report 14, biggest study ever done for the Air Force. Mm-hmm. How come it wasn't mentioned in those other books? And Dr. Leon Davidson, who had gotten it published, had included the Air Force press release from the early 50s, which included the crazy statement On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3%, excuse me, could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems straightforward. The only trouble was I had the report. The unknowns weren't 3% or 6% or 12%. They were 21.5%.
Mm-hmm.
That's not 3 rounded off where I come from.
Yeah.
You know? And also, they had quality evaluations of 3,201 sightings, charts, tables, graphs, maps, loaded with data, facts, evidence. And the quality evaluation showed the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. That's what you'd expect if the sightings were real.
Mm-hmm.
And so that report made me angry. I don't like being lied to, especially by the Air Force. The Secretary of the Air Force was quoted as making that statement. And so that I got determined. I'm going to find out what's really going on here. There has to be something going on if the government lies so blatantly. You know, I was accustomed to dealing with security and tiptoeing around the truth sometimes. But this was a blatant lie. And so I joined APRO and NICAP, the 2 big UFO groups, to get their newsletters and stuff, to learn more. And somebody at work asked me to speak to their book review club. Oh, I got to know Frank Edwards, yes, Flying Saucer Serious Business. He was living in Indianapolis. And I got a copy of his book. And then when I was working in Pittsburgh at Westinghouse, I called Frank and I said, Frank, you know everybody. He was a newsman and he did know everybody. And give me some names here in Pittsburgh. You know, I want to go public. So he gave me some names, and one of them was the producer of a radio show called Contact, would you believe? And I was on, and I wasn't as good then as dealing with the nasty, noisy negativists, but apparently I did okay. And somebody at work at Westinghouse heard the program. She had a book review club, and they were reading Frank's book and asked if I would give a talk to her club. So that my first lecture was in her living room.
Oh, wow.
Not a big production.
Yeah.
But I did the show several times more. It was on KDKA, which is the biggest station in Pittsburgh. And I got asked one day. These things happen by accident. One of 2 days in the 3-year period where I got a ride into work with Joanne, a PhD from Carnegie Tech, Carnegie Mellon University, and was telling her how much I'd like to speak at Carnegie Mellon. She said, well, did you talk to the dean? And I said, no. She said, he's my husband, Stan. He's heard you on the radio. Give him a call. And so I called him, and a talk was arranged. And it was amazing. The crowd was great, a few hundred. And there were no nasty, noisy, negativist questions. And, things went extremely well. And it gave me a taste. And the guy whose wife I had talked to, sent a nice letter to the agency through whom he had booked the other speakers. And they booked me. I mean, from him, his last question to me when he was, how much do you want? And I said, $100. I would have taken $50, frankly. But he booked me, and because I knew his wife, he told me what he was paying the other speakers. $1,500, $1,700.
And at that time, that's probably a lot of money. It's a lot of money now, so that's why I'm saying that.
He sent a nice letter to the agent who had booked me, and then I booked the agent booked me at the Engineering Society of Detroit. How much more respectable can you get? I mean, I buy Japanese cars, but that doesn't count.
Yeah.
And they were sold out 2 weeks in advance for 1,000 people, 1,008 people for dinner and a talk. I'll always remember that number. And no nasty, negativist attitudes. And that impressed me, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And I was still pretty darn young, but 1,008 people, holy cow. You know, so we had our successful test of the nuclear rocket engine, and naturally, as a result of that, the program was canceled.
Yeah, it seems to always be the case with stuff with success. Let me ask you, because you said that you were at Westinghouse while you were doing a lot of this. Was it weird? And I can only assume, I'll let you talk about it, security clearances. My assumption is you probably had one at this time.
I had a Q clearance from, it took a couple of months to get one when I started work at GE, but all during that time, and that had been in 56, and this was in the late 70s. Yes, I had a Q clearance the whole time.
So was it weird?
Necessary.
Was it weird to have that, weird for you to have the clearance, be working in these security projects, but then on your own time, you're researching the lies and the cover-ups of the same agencies that the companies you're working for are contracted by?
Weird might not be the word I would have used, but I was well aware of it. And it's, I will say this. It's one of the things that kept me as honest as you could possibly be. I didn't want to get into any trouble. And I respected security. And, there's a basic rule. You can't tell your friends without also telling your enemies. They read the newspapers. They listen to the radio and all the rest of that. So I've had people say, well, of course you told your wife what you were doing. No, I never told my wife anything classified. It's against the rules. I could lose my job. And I don't know where there's a spy sitting around. No, you don't. Very important. And I know once I had to carry my own slides with me for a classified program I was going to be giving about probably nuclear airplanes. Yeah, shielding for nuclear airplanes. And I'll tell you, they sit you down and they indoctrinate you. And, the slides go with you. Not in the trunk of your car that you're driving, not the rental car. No, with you, on your person. And if the plane crashes, we need your itinerary. If the plane crashes, we don't care about you. We care about the
slides.
Classified material you're calling. So I was so glad to get rid of that stuff.
Yeah, I would imagine.
So I think I did once have somebody ask me to go over to his home after a lecture I gave in Texas, and indicated that I was being kept. There was an eye being kept on me, but that they approved what I was doing. I was not. It was okay. And that was a relief. I mean, I was not surprised somebody was paying attention, but pleased that I wasn't stepping across the line. And it's something I've always tried to be very careful about. And again, because it could cost my job, and national security is not a trivial matter.
Yeah.
I know some people think it doesn't matter to anybody, but it does to me, even though I haven't had a clearance. It's all, since those first 14 years, so that would be from 1970 on. I haven't had a clearance. And look, security is necessary for a lot of things. It's like the first spy satellite, the Corona spy satellite. Again, people don't appreciate maybe the first 12 launches. We knew the U-2 would be destroyed at some point, which it was. You're probably not even old enough to remember that, but it came as quite of a shock on our spy planes.
With Gary Powers, yeah. No, yeah. I wasn't around then, but I do definitely know the story and have gone after quite a few documents about it.
Yeah, and security is important.
Yeah.
You do have to be careful about it. And I mentioned the Corona spy satellite. We knew that the U-2s would reach their limit. There were 12 unsuccessful launches of an attempt to put a Corona spy satellite in space. The 13th one worked. You can imagine how much money we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And it got more data, Soviet military construction. It's just going round and round and looking. Than all the U-2 flights that had preceded it. It was not declassified. It went on for many years. and it was only declassified after it got replaced by other ones. I got a real kick out of one of the things about Corona. They deorbited the film. They kicked it out of the spacecraft, and an Air Force plane caught it like a big net.
No kidding.
Out over the Pacific in secret.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of neat.
That's actually very cool. I've never heard that about Corona. I think one of the things on your point that most people don't realize today, and I'm often ridiculed for saying this, because I've spent now more than half of my life, decades of my life, going after government secrets. But I come from a family who has had clearances, top secret clearances.
Oh.
My grandfather worked on propulsion systems, and we kind of traced some of his research, and we believe that it led into the Saturn V rockets that took us to the moon. He was working at Bell Aircraft and worked on the Bell X-1 and then the Bell X-5 that crushed every record that the X-1 was.
Good stuff.
Yeah, very cool. But where I'm often ridiculed is I actually support that some secrets should be kept. And I think a lot of people, they back people like Edward Snowden, and I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I have been very outspoken about what he has done and people trying to spill the beans about some of these classified programs and classified, things that are going on.
I'm not for the bean spillers, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, and neither am I, and I'm glad to hear you say that, but I think it's important, and I think you've reinforced it, that some secrets should be kept. And that's going to lead me to my next question to you. So after you read all this material on UFOs, you went from intrigue to anger because obviously you're feeling lied to. Obviously, you kind of went full bore and went after the Roswell incident and really did an amazing job getting out in the field, literally talking to people, going to archives, going through documents. What made you push on that specifically on Roswell versus, Socorro or some of these other UFO cases? What was it about Roswell?
I got very lucky. I heard about it from a television program producer in Louisiana. I was giving a lecture, and the students brought me to the station to do 3 interviews. And when I finished one of them, the third one, the producer said, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he?
Yeah.
Well, his next sentence changed my life. He handled records of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What?
Mm-hmm.
It came out of the blue, and there was nobody around. He wasn't joking. This was not a casual offhand remark. I said, what do you know about him? Well, he lives over in Homa. Great guy. It turns out they were ham radio buddies, had been for years. And when I later asked him, what did Jesse tell you? He didn't tell me anything. This guy, the producer, had seen the articles in the newspaper back there in 47. Army captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region, and a few hours later, Air Force says only weather balloon radar reflector combination. I took care of that, And so Roswell intrigued me, and I was impressed. I called information. For the young people, that's how you used to get phone numbers. You didn't go on your computer because you didn't have one.
Yeah.
You called information, and the information operators were very knowledgeable. You could say, is that in a nice part of town? And things like that. They would know a lot.
Times were different.
So I got a number for Jesse. Now, I was impressed by him as a person, but also, look at his position. He was the intelligence officer for the only atomic bombing group in the entire world at the time. In the world. The Russians didn't have one until 49. And so you don't get to be that without having a lot on the ball. And General, the man who was head of the 509th, went on. He was a colonel when he was at Roswell, but he went on to be a 4-star general. He was vice chief of staff of the United States Air Force when he died of a massive heart attack. Again, not a dink. And so I found out about Roswell, in the 70s. And I first heard about it from somebody else. So it was the second time around on what I was just talking about. A woman named Lydia Sleppy. A colleague and I had talked to her son who had a good sighting. He said, you ought to talk to my mom. And we did. And she had lived in Albuquerque, and she had the Roswell story to some limited extent, in other words. And so, you do your thing, but it was only after talking to Jesse that Bill Moore and I went after finding people. First year, we found 60 people in conjunction with Roswell.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them, of course, was Walter Haut. Talk about luck, John. You know about this. Every once in a while, good things happen when you're not expecting them. I didn't know anything about Roswell, so I looked, and they've got a newspaper. I looked in editor and publisher, Roswell Daily Record. Called them and asked, I'm trying to get some more information. I have a story here about something that happened years ago, and it mentioned Walter Haut, or Haut. His name is spelled 3 different ways in the articles I had.
Mm-hmm.
And I was shocked when the gal on the other end says, his wife works here. What?
Wow.
So I talked to the wife. Then I talked to Walter, and he was a great help. He had a copy of the base yearbook, which he made for me.
Mm-hmm.
And he remembered a lot of the people. He was the PIO, but he also, for those who say, well, public information was a big deal, he was also a World War II bombardier, more than 20 bombing missions over Japan, and dropped the instrument package on one of the nuclear weapons tests in 1946. You pick your best guy to do that, because we didn't have a lot of nuclear weapons back then.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to waste one. If you don't have your instrument package in the right place at the right time, it's a wasted explosion. That's silly. So Walter was very special, and I did check. He was well thought of in town. But Bill Moore and I found over 60 people in the first year after that. I was impressed with the people I talked to, their backgrounds, and what I could dig out from the newspapers and stuff. And so Roswell, you could say I'm fixated on Roswell. They love me in Roswell. But to give your audience some idea of how interested people are, last year, the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell had 223,000 visitors.
That's crazy.
From all over the world. I mean, especially when you consider Roswell's in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 200 miles from Albuquerque, 200 miles from Amarillo, 200 miles from El Paso. It's not on the way to anywhere. It's not a place people drive by.
You got to want to go there. I've been there myself. You literally have to. It's like you said. It's not on the road and you take a 5-minute detour. It's out there. It's quite a hike.
Yeah, and so I say that not to impress people about me, but to let them know there are a lot of people interested in the subject, or they wouldn't make that, drag their kids, to Roswell. And to me, it's only fitting, John. You realize that the base was closed. They've got a 13,000-foot runway there. Runways are typically 9,000 or 10,000 at the Roswell Army Airfield, because that's where the 509th was based. And these huge B-36s were lumbering in there and out there. And so it's special. But when Lyndon Johnson ran for president in 1964, New Mexico didn't vote for him. So after he became president, he closed the base in New Mexico and moved it to Texas. Amazing.
Yeah. Well,
so it seems fitting to me that they get the benefit of the government lies and cover-up and all that sort of stuff. There were lots of people working at the base, and they were put out of work for no good reason at all.
Yeah, sadly, that happens way too often around the country. But specifically in Roswell, after you spoke to everybody, Walter Haut and all these people that had the direct connection, to kind of bottom line it for the audience, how convinced are you that it was an alien spacecraft and not some other top secret weather balloon?
Very, very convinced. Partly because remember that Jesse Marcel had a top secret clearance when he was there. as the intelligence officer for the 509. And the way the government would deal with something like that was to say, look, this is classified technology, and we cannot say anything about it.
Yeah.
And nobody did anything like that.
And I think that's, not to interrupt you, that's a very important point, because with a top secret clearance, being who he was on that base, anything in or around or on that base that was highly classified, he would know about it. So as decades go on, you get involved, the Air Force keeps changing their story. You would think that he would, in essence, have the quote unquote real answer if it was technology. But what did he tell you? Did he tell you it was alien, just to make sure the audience knows what you heard from him?
He had handled wreckage. He saw the pieces of wreckage because Mac Brazel had brought them into the sheriff's office, and the sheriff had sent him to the base, and he talked to Jesse. And he talked to a lot of people, and Walter had talked to a lot of people, and they made very clear that there was no indication from then Colonel Blanchard, that this was our technology. And as I say, from my own working on classified programs, if it had been ours, I believe the word would have been put out to keep your damn mouth shut.
Yeah.
And everybody would have paid attention. Believe me, they would have. Because that's how these things work. So, the story was buried very quickly. But the more witnesses you talked to and the more data you heard, I was stuck. This darn thing was real. And, there have been debunkers all over the place. To debunk is easy. You don't need to know anything. Just denial, denial, denial. If the first explanation doesn't work, try a second one. If that doesn't work, try a third one.
Just keep trying until something sticks.
Yeah. And so Roswell, I focused a lot of attention on it, sure. But I was able to get, because I started, somewhere near the top, somebody who was directly involved, Jesse, get access to lots of people and get stories from lots of people. And what can I say? Not everybody in the world is a liar all the time, which is what you'd have to say if you say the story isn't true. Do I believe everything anybody ever told me? Of course not. But you try to evaluate on the basis of who's trustworthy. And as I say, Blanchard went on to be a 4-star general and vice chief of staff of the Air Force. This is not a dink.
Yeah.
This is not somebody with nothing better to do but twiddle his thumbs and make up stories and stuff like that. And I did talk to Blanchard's daughter and 2 sons. I've talked to an awful lot of people because he was dead when I got involved in this thing. I couldn't talk to him. I would have if I could have, but I don't know how to get to the other side.
Yeah. And after all you've done, and you're convinced, so now you're saying that you're convinced, and that to be honest with you, knowing you personally and knowing your background, that's good enough for me when it comes to Roswell. Just simply because I know you've done the legwork. It's not 1 or 2 or 3 people that support this story, but rather you have talked to an exceptional amount. Let me ask you then, before we move away from Roswell, what do you feel, after everything that you've done and researched and who you've talked to, what do you feel the motivation is by the military and by the government to cover this up? And the reason why I ask, other than the obvious one, is it is so blatant, not only with your research and your books, which, by the way, for those listening, if you haven't checked them out, definitely check out the books. You can order them online and see a lot more about Stanton Friedman at www.stantonfriedman.com. That's StantonFriedman.com. Definitely check out those books. But Stan, after everything that you've done, that in itself is amazing. But when you look at how blatant the lie really is, I love doing public lectures, and I start with the most recent explanation, quote unquote, for the Roswell incident by the government. And it is so easy to dismiss pretty much everything that they try and claim about the Roswell incident. It's not a stretch. There's no leaked documents. There's not one guy who told me something in a dark garage one day. It is using their own documents to disprove their own story. Why is that
crash
so?
Test dummies dropped 6 years later aren't good enough for you?
Yeah, and it's ridiculous how blatant the cover-up is, meaning the lies, and you can prove it. Why is it? Meaning, why are they doing this? Why is it so easy to disprove it? And what is their motivation to keep the lie going?
Well, I've worried about that. Obviously, you may have noticed I don't speak for the government.
You're right.
I think there are several reasons. Major one is technology. In other words, if we have wreckage and are trying to learn from it, and if our enemies find that out, then they can put it together with what they have learned, and maybe they can beat us to the punch and, developing a higher, faster, farther kind of vehicle. Secondly, I think that we tend to forget. I've got to look up the latest number, how many countries there are on planet Earth, but I think it's over 190. There aren't many people thinking of themselves as Earthlings. Mm-hmm. People in power want to stay in power. And I think that's one of the reasons you don't want to get the world thinking that this is a planet and should have a government, because if it does, then I'm not going to be doing what I'm doing, says the guy in charge. Also, I think there is a feeling that the aliens at some time or other may decide not to land on a White House lawn, which is one of those silly notions. It's a no-fly zone, but to come clean. And times have changed. Look, the Pope has talked about life in outer space. Times really have changed. And the biggest thing is the Kepler satellite space telescope, if you will. When Frank Drake and Carl Sagan were talking about life in outer space, and let's listen for radio signals, and all this kind of stuff, Frank was talking about 8,000, there may be 8,000 places I could be sending us signals. 8,000 planets. Mm-hmm. The latest numbers from Kepler indicate there are 1.6 planets per star. So in our galaxy alone, that would be well over 100 billion planets. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying they all have life. Maybe only 10%, maybe 2%. You're still talking about a huge number.
Yeah, even a fraction of a percent.
Usually the kids learn that the nearest star is 4.3 light years away. But if you look at the neighborhood, there are loads of stars that have other stars much, much closer to them than that. My favorite pair, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, from the Betty Hill star map stuff described in my book, Captured, etc. Those two stars are only 39.3 light years from here, but from each other, they're only an eighth of a light year apart. The other one is visible all day long from a planet around the other one. That's more than 30 times closer to each other than we are to the next star over. So we're out in the boonies.
Mm-hmm. We're on the outskirts.
The other thing that's changed, Bishop Ussher in the 16th century, I guess it was, figured out he was interested in sex. He looked at all the begats in the Bible and figured out that the world was created in about 4004 BC. So it's 6,000 years old. Now we know that the Earth alone is a good 4 billion years old, give or take a few tens of millions of years. So that leaves time for others to have developed trips to the neighbors. Mm-hmm. Because everybody is going to ask two questions, among many. Are we alone? And how do you get there? Mm-hmm. And what do they want out there? And when you start looking at things that way, everybody is also going to ask an obvious question: how does the sun work? Mm-hmm. People don't realize 100 years ago we thought the sun was a mass of burning gas.
Yeah.
And it turns out it isn't. It's nuclear fusion going on there. And I'm one of the few people can say I worked on a study of fusion propulsion way back in 1962.
Mm-hmm.
And if you got the dough, you can go. That was the conclusion. So I'm saying every civilization is going to ask the question, how does that star of ours produce its energy?
Yeah.
We figured it out in 1938. That's after I was born.
Mm-hmm.
And, fission and then fusion. And again, people don't understand how much of a jump it is. These aren't just a little better than a chemical rocket. A big bomb in World War II, and of which there were many dropped, was a 10-ton blockbuster. Released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. Wow. Make a big hole in the ground. All right. Okay. The first atomic bomb, 1945, a fission device, released the energy of 15,000 tons of dynamite.
Wow.
Not 10 tons, 15,000 tons. The first H-bomb, a fusion device, 1952, released the energy of 10 million tons of dynamite.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians set off Tsar Bomba, the name of that.
Yes, I've read about that.
It's
scary how big.
50 million tons of dynamite.
That's insane. That is the biggest explosion, right, to date?
Yes. Yeah, and the kicker is, what I'm saying is not to scare people about nuclear explosions, but to realize to any alien in this neighborhood, he knows we could go out and bother them.
Mm-hmm.
Fusion would do the job. And our track record is pretty damn bad, if you pardon the expression, but we killed 50 million people in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
We destroyed 1,700 cities. Would anybody in the neighborhood want us to take our brand of friendship out there?
Yeah.
I don't think so. They'd keep their eye on us. And, maybe you say, well, we're really good guys at heart. Yeah, but look at the evidence now.
Yeah.
50 million deaths? You don't value life very much, do you, Earthlings?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think
so
that's a huge conversation in itself, wherein would aliens then at that point care to either come here or if they've been here, come back? You know what I mean? Because if there is one civilization that has the ability to reach us and can visit planet Earth, the biggest question that I've struggled with now for more than 20 years is I don't know if they've been here or not, but if they have, would they ever care to come back? I mean, we are that anthill, in my opinion, the anthill in the middle of the Sahara Desert that isn't worth their time. You know what I mean?
Well, they have to quarantine us, John.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, well, quarantine, but just by quarantining, they can just ignore. You know what I mean? I mean, we just don't have
and have us show up on their doorsteps with nuclear weapons, ready to enforce their will on us.
Yeah,
us on them.
But do you think?
I don't think the Galactic Federation wants to allow that kind of stuff to go on.
And this is an honest question, because I think that this is a big one. Do you think, it doesn't even matter, the biggest nuclear bomb that we've exploded, when the Soviets did it, do you think that would even threaten them at all? It threatens us, and it scares the bejeebers out of probably a lot of people who weren't aware of the magnitude of the nuclear weapons. But to a civilization who can traverse the stars, and this is an honest question, do you think that would even be remotely close to the technology and the weaponry that someone like that has?
No, probably not, because we haven't been around long enough to develop the ultimate, if you will. But it would be enough to say, keep your eye on the idiots over there.
Yeah.
At the rate they're... Look, we have exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them underwater and all the rest of them. Some of them weren't huge. That isn't the point. It tells you something about the civilization here. So I don't think the Galactic Federation Intelligence Agency, I just made up a new alphabet soup agency, would want to let us zip along at our own speed and come out and threaten them.
Mm-hmm.
We're warlike. We're nasty. Like I say, 50 million lives is not peanut butter, you know? So I think that I think there are good reasons for they're not landing and saying, okay, guys, here's the way you got to do business. I think there are rules. Because I think an advanced civilization makes rules to protect its citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't really done that. You know, here at war, there at war. That's the way it goes on Earth.
Yeah.
There's probably a song there.
No, and there absolutely is a song. There's 195 countries, to go back to what you were saying before.
Good.
Yeah. So there's 195 countries as we talk. And to be honest with you, there's 195 mindsets of how this planet should be run. And to your point, I don't think there's any unity to that fact, meaning, and the number's growing from what I understand, from 109. Right. So, I mean, people aren't coming together and joining hands and living in a paradise. Sadly, it is quite the opposite, where we have wars going on and different parts of the world and different countries, and people who hate each other still hate each other, and so on and so forth. So sadly, there's just no unity here on the planet Earth. And not to sound a little new agey, but sadly, we do need to get to that point where we work together and figure out, because we are going to have to figure out how to get off this planet and join that galactic federation if it exists. We have a Space Force now, so why not, create and join the Galactic Federation? Because I did a show, Stan, I don't know if you saw it, but it was about the end of the world. It was on History Channel, and I got to produce and write this thing, and it was called, I didn't, between you and me and everyone listening, I didn't care for the ultimate title it ended up. Originally, it was called The End, but it ended up Doomsday, 10 Ways the Planet Will Die. And every episode talked about nuclear war or an asteroid impact or so on and so forth. So this production company called me and they said, okay, we've got an episode. The synopsis is, if aliens come here and their intent is malicious, what happens? And so I got to literally write a 1-hour show on that. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'll have to send you a link to it so you can watch it. But my whole point is and that goes to my question to you earlier, was, could we even ding their armor, so to speak, with what we've got? Because if they're there and they can traverse the stars, they've got an awful lot.
Well, star travel is not such a big deal. And I mentioned nuclear. I didn't point out that, for example, World War II submarine, U-boats, big threat to shipping everywhere, could stay underwater for 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Now they can go around the world without coming to the surface.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. They need a tanker nearby. They can operate for 18 years without refueling, John. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm saying. Part of the picture here. You remember the Malmstrom Air Force Base case. They're paying attention to where we have nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So we're looming large in somebody's telescope. Keep your eye on the idiots. Mm-hmm. They're out there.
Yeah, that's us. In the last 10 minutes here with you, Stan, because I know you're packing your bags literally to go to Roswell here in the next day. So I do appreciate you taking the time. But in the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about today, ufology today, and the state of research into this field. I mean, obviously, the last 7 months has been 7-8 months has been fairly exciting. We've got news of a secret Pentagon UFO study, which is fairly controversial still. We don't know a whole lot about it. A lot of speculation and rumor out there. We don't know, exactly what it is. But with that being said, it's an exciting time. And sadly, you did announce your retirement earlier this year from the field. And as a friend of yours, I'm telling you, you seem more busy in your retirement than you did while you were active. So hopefully you were getting some rest.
Look, this trip to Roswell, which I leave tomorrow, is my last big trip. I've got another lecture booked in South Carolina, which has been booked for many, many months, and maybe one in California, and that's it. Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm going to be 84, John.
Yeah, well, 84 years young.
You're not supposed to be traipsing around the galactic neighborhood when you're 84.
Yeah, well, you've done amazing in the 84 years young that you've been around. Let me go back to that question though of what you feel today is. Are you happy with what the field is today from the late 1960s on? Are you disturbed? What's going on?
I think it's a mix. There are things that bother me. There are things that please me. I think that I noticed the MUFON Journal is getting fancier, looking good. Serious effort. What I want to know, and you mentioned the release of information last December and January, Luis Elizondo and others, and the fact that there was a secret program for cost. We only spent $22 million, which is peanuts. But the question I want to have an answer to, and I've been impressed with what I've seen of Elizondo and some of the others, but my question is, where is the paper? You don't have government-sponsored programs without there being reports generated. That's the nature of the beast. You can't avoid paper. Progress reports, quarterly reports, semi-annual reports, annual reports, technical reports, they're all over the place. We haven't seen one.
Yep. Yeah.
And why? And was it because the original story came out and they were afraid to prosecute the people for releasing it because then that would be admitting that it was true? But they're withholding the rest? I don't know. It bothers me. I want to see those reports, guys.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that's been one of the red flags and concerns for me. Now, I will say that the official line from the government side is that the reports, everything that you just mentioned, and this is why I love you to death, is that you know what to go after. So those are the reports that I'm going after. And according to a couple different agencies now, mostly the Office of the Secretary of Defense, everything that you just mentioned would be at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And sadly, out of the entire government, federal, et cetera, that is the worst agency that they could be at because they are roughly approximately about 2 years backlogged. I literally just got a FOIA response from them. I kid you not, about a week and a half ago, that was in response to a request I did in 2014. So that could, And so, 4 years on that one alone, the average is about 1.5 to 2 years. Now, so to go back to your point, where is everything? Where's the beef? The official line, it's at the DIA, but once it gets processed, we could wait 2 years for nothing because that request that I did in 2014, if you can believe it, the responsive records were 100% classified. So I waited 4 years for them to tell me that they couldn't give it to me. So that being said, I'm with you. I want to see the beef. I want to see the original stuff, the progress reports, the quarterly reports, but again, that's a show in itself. So tomorrow, where do you think ufology is?
I think it's sitting waiting for old guys like me to retire, I guess, among other things. But
no, we don't want you to go, to be honest with you.
Well,
at all.
I'm still at the end of a phone. I can do that easily without. I went to Arkansas several months ago. It took me 4 flights to get there from here.
Yikes.
That's tough walking around airports, I'll tell you, at my age anyway. But I think there is definitely a difference in attitude. I don't get many people saying we're the only ones anymore. And, there's an old saying, if you will, new ideas come to be accepted, not because their opponents come to believe in them, but because their opponents die and a new generation grows up that's accustomed to them. And I think we're living at a time where we're accustomed to the idea of there being aliens out there. It's not a shocking notion to young people. Oh, sure, we can go in space. Why couldn't they be going in space? And so I'm pleased that I think we're going to be moving forward. And I think there will be more people who take it seriously. I think that there will be more stories. Maybe we won't get the documents sent to CIA. I'm not an optimist about that, but I think there will be more people who may make deathbed confessions because the ground has already been walked on, so to speak. And so I'm still an optimist, John. yeah, sure, I would like to have said 20 years ago, oh, we'll know everything in 10 years. You know, I couldn't have said then, and I won't now. But I think the tone is right. That is, I think people have grown accustomed to the notion that there are aliens out there. Not necessarily that they're coming here, that the government has covered up, although I always get a great response when I show an NSA UFO document where you can read one sentence per page. Or, you know, there's those hundreds of CIA documents all blacked out, redacted. That sounds so much better than blacked out.
Yeah. And that's why they use whiteout on some of them, so it doesn't look as striking.
Well, yeah, the NSA documents, I got 156 pages of top secret Umbra material. You can read one sentence per page. And the NSA actually put out a memo, haven't looked at it in a long time, saying that we have reason to believe that some or all of our agencies will receive requests from Stanton Friedman. I gave my address, but they blacked that out on what I got. For information about UFOs, if such a request is received, do not respond as required by Air Force regulation, blah, 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 blah. Instead, send the request to headquarters. If there's nothing to cover up, what do you make statements like that for? You know?
Yeah, they're worried. They're worried that people ask questions like you have done and have done beautifully for decades. They're afraid of that. And I think people most people are just comfortable taking what I call the company line and moving on. They go back to their cell phones and their reality TV, and they don't care to ask questions. And I think, as indicative by that memo you just talked about, when people like you come along and they ask questions and they push back, that in itself is part of that national security problem about UFOs that keeps me curious. I don't know if you feel the same way, but it's that cover up that is so blatant. I can't lose interest. I can't stop. You know, I just keep kind of pushing.
I know the feeling, John. And look, people ask me who's coming along that you would trust, and yours is the first name that comes to mind.
Well, I'm honored that you would say that.
Who's pushed hard, and how shall I put it, legally. You've gone through channels. You've done things the right way. You haven't disgraced the field. There are people who wail loudly, making all kinds of claims. It isn't good enough to make claims. You got to do something about it.
Yep.
You know, show me the paper kind of thing.
That's right. And there's not a whole lot of true original research out there. And you know, I could talk to you all day long. And sadly, you know, this is kind of the end of the hour that we allotted for our dialogue here. But I really do hope, obviously we're friends and we'll continue to talk, but on the air, I want to tell you, hopefully you do realize not only with me, how much of an inspiration that you have been because of that original research and because of that hard work. I mean, you truly were the pioneer in this and showing others, hey, don't be afraid to do this. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I can tell you that I probably don't just speak for myself with that. So I hope when we hang up, even though we'll probably talk again very soon, for everyone out there, just know that you're an inspiration to them too. And I think that for anybody who wants to learn more about Stanton, he really is the real deal. I don't say it that often. As you guys will listen to this show and hopefully continue to listen week after week, it is very rare for me to truly endorse the work of somebody. Stanton is definitely one of them. Check him out at www.stantonfriedman.com. Amazon has you listed, Stan, as the author of 12 books. Is that an accurate number?
Well, I would have said 6, but there are some things that some people call books that I don't call books.
I got you. Okay. Well, it spits out 12, I believe, on Amazon. Regardless, buy them all. If you're listening, they're definitely well worth it, well researched. And again, that original research that we all know and love. So, Stanton, thank you so much for joining me on this first episode. It was only fitting out of this entire field for me to ask you to appear with me on this first show, which I'm very excited about, and there's a lot of exciting shows coming. But thank you for taking the time.
It's been my pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.